Tony D and little Joan behind me, and this is a screenwriter's tip, really a writing tip or creative tip on how to come up with an original idea. Now, I just have a background up. I usually put up YouTube when I can't find anything. Anyhow, smash a like and subscribe. Thank you for liking and subscribing. Check out my books, The Pineys, books 1 through 17, available at Amazon.com. Don't forget, Kindle Unlimited is free. Book 18 dropping this month, and don't forget the t-shirt store from Fourth Wall. The link is in the description. Okay, so how to come up with an original idea. I use a lot of improv techniques when I'm trying to think of stuff. I always make the joke at shows. People ask me, how do you come up with ideas? And I tell them, I send 1995 to a company in Camden, New Jersey called the Idea Factory, and they send you a big envelope of ideas. And then they go, really? So you just buy them? And I go, no, I just made that up. So improv works with like a stream of consciousness, a lot of it. The idea is you generate ideas. So there are different improv games you can play to sort of get your mind warmed up. You usually need a group of people to do it, but you can just sort of go down the same path that would take you in a process on your own. So the first thing you want to think of is, you want to narrow down the idea, right? Because people sit around and they go, well, I want to write a screenplay, or I want to write a book, or I want to write this or that, or I want to come up with something. And the idea is often very broad. So one of the functions of a writer or creative person is you're making creative decisions. So you have to finally pick a direction, right? You can't go in all directions at once, so you have to pick one direction to go in. And it's about narrowing down your options in a way that comes together that makes a certain amount of sense. And I say certain amount of sense, like it has to make sense. Just like in a screenplay, the physics of your universe have to be consistent. So you can't constantly keep, driving left and then driving right and then driving up and then driving down. You want to go in basically one general direction and stick with that. So if you start with a sci-fi idea, you want to stick with your sci-fi. If you start with a mystery, you don't want to abandon it halfway through for a romance or whatever. So you want to pick sort of a category of an idea to kind of narrow it down, right? So the easiest thing to do is to pick a genre. Pick a genre that you want to, your project, your story in. Okay? So I'll just sort of pick one at random. Let's see, something from the screen. Oh, okay, here we go. Elric. We'll pick fantasy. All right, let's say I want to do a new fantasy story. All right, I've narrowed it down to fantasy. So first thing you want to do is brainstorm a little bit. What do fantasy stories normally entail? You also want to get spun up on the classic fantasies that have already been done. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. And you want to see what contemporary fantasy looks like today. So for instance, one of the contemporary fantasy book trends is called romancy. And this is sort of like basically fantasy but romance. So sword and sorcery, but the focus is on the romance, not necessarily the sword and sorcery. And then you want to look at a lot of the tropes, right? So what are a lot of the tropes in fantasy? Well, there are the chosen one. That's a big one in fantasy, right? Somebody who's chosen, has a great destiny. Usually a kid with a sword who's going to become king or going to slay the dragon, rescue the princess. These are all tropes from fantasy, and you kind of want to acknowledge them all in your, you haven't written anything yet, but you're just sort of acknowledging already gone before. And you want to start to think, well, what would be different? What would be different in a fantasy world? Now, a lot of people, a lot of rookie writers will go right for the obvious, right? Oh, well, I'll write a fantasy story where there's a robot. Well, you can do that. I mean, and it's been done, hate to tell you. Um, who did it? What's his face? In the back of Dragon magazine, they had a backup comic called Snarf Quest, and one of the characters was a robot. He landed on their medieval planet and joined the group, and they thought he was a knight, but no, he was a robot. Um, but yeah, you want to think little differences. This is a writing exercise I read in Writer's Digest. You can take a character trope, and the example they give is the Irish cop, and you list all the qualifications of how the cliche, the Irish cop cliche. He's Irish. He wears like a police uniform. He twirls his little baton there. He talks in an Irish accent. He loves his mom. He's Catholic. He's this. He's that. And then you want to start turning it on its head and make something different. So the example they gave, well, he's an Irish beat cop, but he loves psychedelic music, right? So that makes him a different kind of character. Even though he's based on a cliche, you're kind of getting away from the cliche by putting something in there that's so, against the grain for that trope. You get something different. So you want to do something similar for fantasy. You want to come up with another angle to it. So, for instance, you might combine genres. You might say, well, I'm going to do, and this is something I think Razorfist did in his book. He did something because he's a big fan of film noir. I'm pretty sure his fantasy book is fantasy noir. I think he's got like a thief character. I'm not sure. I haven't read it, but that's a vibe I get off of him. That would be different. I mean, I don't think that's something that's been done a lot, if it's been done at all. He may be the first. I don't know. Elric is kind of along those lines. It's a little dark. Noir being like all the characters are bad, and then really your protagonist is the least bad character. Everybody's got a flaw. Everybody's got a terrible secret, so to speak. So that's a different blend when you do it like that. You take fantasy and then you take noir. That's why somebody took fantasy and romance and combined them, and now we have this big trend. But that trend's dying, so that I think you want to stay away from that trend if it's dying. You look at another big thing in fantasy comics or fantasy stories is magic items and big epic quests. Well, you might do the opposite. Do a smaller, more grounded story without magic. It might have fantastic creatures in it and an important story, but it has no epic quest. Maybe it's just about a story that would take place, for instance, in a hobbit village or a village made up of dwarfs or even just humans. And but it does take place in a fantasy world, and maybe that you see the trappings of that fantasy world on the outskirts, but your main characters kind of stick to farming, living their lives, and you can make it in such a way that it would be different. It would be a different story, right? Like how do peasants survive in a world of epic fantasy? And maybe behind the scenes, they're the ones who make things work because they're growing all the food. They're doing all the practical stuff. That could be a fun pitch. Some guys have done other things with it. I mean, there's a million ways you can go. But you want to start picking something like that and just start going down that path, right? So if we're going to do the very grounded, reality-based fantasy story, which is a little bit of a contradiction, but You can make it work. Um, you want to push it as far as it will go, right? You want to, have a character who maybe just misses out on all this epic fantasy, or maybe he's the character that stays behind while his friend, becomes the chosen one and keeps hearing about him, but he never sees him anymore because he's out doing his epic quest, whatever it is. Um, and you just keep writing lists of characters and concepts like that, and pretty soon you're going to have some kind of different fantasy story. And then you want to get down into the gritty details. What's a epic fantasy character like? Well, he's often very unusual, uh, very strong and powerful, or with the potential to have great power. Maybe you got a guy who's the complete opposite. He's just a very average dude, but maybe he's smart. I mean, protagonists are often very smart, at least as smart as you. And he's very pragmatic and practical. And he doesn't have any time for all this magic nonsense. And maybe that's an advantage somehow in that universe. You could keep spitballing it that way. And you just want to once you have a concept like that, you just want to write down all that kind of stuff. And at some point, you want to start crafting the structure of a story. If it's I use the 3-act structure in screenplays as well as novels and other things. I think it's a really good structure. It's very simple. It's basic. You can always expand upon it. But I think the 3-act structure works really well for a story. Now, for a screenplay, it's an absolute must. For novels, it can be different. It can be a little different. But the basic structure is first act. You introduce the characters and their problem, their world, and something happens, something that changes things a bit. Second act, they're dealing with this problem, this change, and as they're doing that, things change around them. They change. They go on a journey of some kind, not a literal journey necessarily. It may be an emotional journey. It may be a journey that's more intellectual. It doesn't have to be an actual moving from place to place journey. And the changes happen and impact the characters and the story in a profound way. And then in the third act, we get, the climax of the story, how this change, affects the characters for good or ill. The obstacle that they faced is defeated, or it defeats them maybe. And then we get some sort of conclusion. With a novel, you'd have more space to explore it. With a screenplay, not so much. It's got to be a lot tighter. And that's, the basic deal. And the further you take your concepts, the more unusual it can be. Now, a lot of people will say, there's nothing new under the sun. I don't think that's really true. I think people who say things like that don't have the imagination. They've sort of given up. And, you can always compare stories and movies to each other. And you might say, for instance, a movie like Citizen Kane is comparable to the Zodiac story. Why, you would say? Well, they're both about people who work in newspapers. That's a similarity. Are they the same story? No, not by a country mile. So, I mean, broadly speaking, they're similar. They're about a particular figure, the search for that figure, in a way. And it involves a few flashbacks and digging for the truth, as it were. And nothing really gets resolved at the end, or kind of does. But they're two very different movies, with their own performances and details. And as they say, the devil's in the details. So don't worry about too much. Like if you end up in a sword and sorcery thing, and it's got some similarities to something you see out there. It is good, however, if you do come up with a really interesting concept, especially if it's in a genre like fantasy, you really want to know the genre. So you should seek out any books that might sound, or stories that sound similar to yours, and you want to read them simply because you want to sort of know what they've done with the concept and see if it's close to what you did or want to do. So that's a good way to get away from reinventing the wheel. Another way to do it is similar to what I did. I picked a very niche subject, the Pine Barrens and the Piney folklore. It's not a big community of people who. There are a lot of authors, but most of the authors in the realm of the Pineys, they don't write fiction. They certainly don't write horror and comedy. It's mostly stories about locals talking about their personal experiences, things about agriculture and geology, the local agriculture and geography, a lot of historical stuff. So mine is in that realm, but it's not. It's definitely apart from most of the others. And you can also separate yourselves in other ways. The details matter. You know, for the Pineys, the way my stuff is separate from most other Piney books is I have really great covers by, of course, the great Vig Starmax, and I'll just click on them to get a. If you haven't seen them, my covers are the best. Vig is the absolute best. I mean, look at that cover. That is insanely good. Vig is just the absolute king, and every time he makes a cover, I mean, look at this. And now I'm just showing off covers. I mean, the Piney that killed Thomas Edison cover, man, the detail on this is incredible. This is, of course, a church that's been, it was pushed into a lake. In the 1700s, there's still an air pocket. You got mother leads hanging up in the background. You got this devil who it's got Thomas Edison's inventions on his back. I mean, it's just badass. But most Piney books, they don't have covers like this. You know, I'll show you some. Pine Barrens. There we go. Yeah, there's John McPhee's classic book. It's got pictures of trees, a photo of the Pine Barrens. There's some of mine. Here's a book called Whitman's Tune. Ooh, here's something called The Wizard of Ong's Hat. I don't know. What is that? I might have to check that out. The Wizard of Ong's Hat. Is this a... I think it might be... I don't know what kind of genre this is. This might be fiction. It's only 39 pages, so it's a short story. Let's see. These have a couple cool covers. That's a nice cover. The Mere Man's Curse. I don't know what that has to do with the Pine Barrens. A Most Important Poem. That's from Cozy, New Jersey Pine Barrens. A Devil in the Pines. A lot of times the covers will be like this. Here's Whispers of the Pines. That's got a nice photo on it. Here's one called The Barrens, a supernatural horror book. This is a little closer to mine, but you can see, again, the cover's very different. Mine's got a more comic booky, pulpy look. A lot of them are like this. The Pine Barrens Devil. I think I met the author of that. A lot of them have these kinds of covers, the old-timey illustration covers. Legend of the Jersey Devil. There's so many of these. Jersey Devil, Creature of the Pine Barrens. More Pine Barrens, Legendary Pine Barrens. So you can see, and then stuff like this, the more historical ones. So anything you could do to separate yourselves from the pack, you want to try to do. And, make your book as different as possible. As different as possible. Let me get back to the page I was on. because every little difference matters, when you're coming up with an original idea. And, again, an original idea is not going to be this thing no one ever heard of. They're going to have heard of some aspect of it, and quite frankly, they're going to hear the words and they have their own interpretation. So, for instance, the Pineys refers to, in my book, the people of the Pine Barrens. That's the original term in South Jersey. It was, a derogatory term for people who lived in the Pine Barrens. But some people refer to the Pine Barrens as the Pineys. Some people in other states have their own version of the Pineys. It doesn't refer to people, it refers to an area of forest. So there are people who will just, in their own brains, interpret your words and your titles differently. And part of your job is to clarify that and to sell them on your idea, what your interpretation is. And so that's why you got to be an expert at your own book and or movie or whatever it is. And another thing that makes an idea or a story connect with people is something that hits them, here. For my book series, it's places in the area. The stories and places that they know. And they're exaggerated to some extent for the purposes of the narrative, but it feels like home to them when they read them. And they're excited to read about their local places. Other people, when you're writing in a fantasy story in a world that doesn't really exist, you have to find some other connection so that people can connect to the characters and relate to them. So if it's a kid coming of age, most people can relate to that. Most people can relate to a parent-child relationship, having a family, being in love. These are all universal concepts that you can use to connect with your readers. And you can't throw those away just because you want an original story per se. You can't move outside the human experience, and neither can your readers. So when we talk about original ideas, it's really the original way you serve it, the way you package it and look at it, and the way you interpret it. And your own particular personal experience colors your story, and that's usually a good thing. And it's why so many young writers, it's hard for them to understand how hard it is for them to write, because they don't have the world experience to bring to a story often. A few of them do, just by some bizarre twist of fate, but others require, or most people require, some time to develop a process and a way to make their stories and ideas sort of shine. So when you're working on these things, don't beat yourself up just because it sounds a little similar to something else. It has to be different, don't get me wrong, but if you're doing a mystery and there's a detective, you can't throw away this. You don't want to necessarily throw away a story just because there's a detective in it. A lot of mysteries have detectives of one kind or another. Now you want to make it a different detective, you can make it there's always the private eye, there's always the police detective. Might be a guy who's retired, might be like the Big Lebowski, right? Jeffrey Bridges' character, the stoner, who's sort of solving the mystery. He's just kind of smart. Kind of, not really. So don't beat yourself up too much. But once you come up with the concept and the core of the character, you want to keep pushing that idea. Push it as far as it will go. You know, depending, like me, I'm doing a book series, so kind of pacing myself. But for you, depending if you're just doing one story, just go for it, man. By the end of that story, you got to push this concept over a cliff and see where it's going to land. And let the process guide you. Even if it takes you to some strange places, you know. At the end of the day, you don't have to publish the story. If it takes you to too weird of a place, you don't want to publish it. But let the process guide you and see where it takes you. And I hope you write an original story. Anyhow, that's it for me, Tony D and Little Joan. What's up for me? I'm doing the Blueberry Festival on July 12th, Saturday from 10 to 4 at Moods Farm. So come out for that. Check out the books. Check out the t-shirt store. Book 18 dropping this month. We'll see you tomorrow.